My name is James, and this happened when I was a sophomore in college. After freshman year, I didn't get a dorm room. Housing filled up fast, and by the time I applied, I was too late. I panicked and scrambled to find anything affordable. After a few weeks of searching, I ended up in a co-op community. 3 old houses, all connected by the same property, but technically separate. It wasn't the best setup. It was farther from campus than I liked, and the houses themselves were kind of run down. But the rent was cheap, and with my bike, I figured I could handle the commute. Most of the residents were young, like me, students trying to save money. But there were a few exceptions: alumni who never really left, graduate students, a couple TAs, and some older folks finishing their degrees later in life. That alone made the community feel unusual, but none of them stood out as much as her. She was an older woman who lived in one of the other houses, late 50s, maybe early 60s. She had gray hair pulled back into a loose bun, and she walked with a limp, as if her back or hip was permanently injured. She always wore the same blank expression, like her face was stuck in neutral. I never saw her laugh, smile, or even frown. Just blank. At first, I assumed she was connected to the university somehow, maybe a staff member or alumni who had some arrangement to live there. Nobody explained who she was, and I didn't ask. But the longer I lived there, the more unsettling she became. The first strange moment happened in our common kitchen. For context, each house had its own kitchen, so she had no reason to be in ours. Yet, one night, while a group of us were cooking dinner, she appeared. She didn't say a word. She wasn't cooking, wasn't eating, wasn't helping. She just stood against the wall, watching. The rest of us were talking, laughing, moving around, and she stayed frozen, her eyes drifting slowly from person to person. At one point, I felt her stare linger on me. When our eyes met, I quickly looked away, but the feeling stuck. I got the weirdest sense that she wasn't just people watching, she was watching me. Nobody else acknowledged her. No greetings, no questions, nothing. It was like she wasn't even there. That struck me as odd. Maybe they knew something I didn't. A few nights later, I was working in my room when I happened to glance out the window. What I saw made my stomach drop. She was standing in the middle of the street. Not on the sidewalk, not in front of her house, but in the middle of the road. Just standing there, staring up at my window. It was cold out and late, but she didn't seem to care. Her face was expressionless, as always, but her body was stiff, like she'd been standing there for a while. I couldn't tell if she was looking at me specifically or just at the house, but my gut told me she was locked on me. For some reason, I raised my hand and gave a small wave. The second I did it, I regretted it. She didn't wave back. Instead, she suddenly jumped up and down, twice, almost like a child who had just been told something exciting. Then, without warning, she turned and sprinted off toward one of the other houses. I sat frozen in my chair, sick to my stomach. Not only had I confirmed she was looking at me, but now she knew exactly which room was mine. Later that night, I asked my housemate about her. He shrugged it off and told me she'd always been there and that everyone just ignored her. When I pressed him, he admitted he didn't actually know anything about her. He'd just been told the same thing when he moved in. That wasn't good enough for me. So, over the next few days, I asked around. Finally, a senior from her house gave me an answer, though not one that helped much. He said she was associated with the university. A little strange, but harmless. Supposedly, she'd never been violent or physical, so people just let her be. I asked why nobody thought it was weird that she wandered into other houses, and he just shrugged, saying housing decisions were up to the property manager. In other words, she wasn't their problem. I wasn't satisfied with that answer. Something about her unsettled me deeply, and soon I had reason to trust my gut. One night, I stepped out of my room past midnight to grab some water. The house was silent. Most people were asleep or out. As I opened my door, I nearly collided with her. She was standing directly in front of my room. I jumped back so hard I nearly fell over. She didn't say anything. She didn't even flinch. She just slowly turned and walked down the hallway, as if I was the one who had intruded on her. That was far from the last time. I started catching her wandering into rooms that weren't hers, standing at the end of hallways, even lingering outside our house when she had no reason to be there. Each time she said nothing. Each time she stared. Then one week I lost my room key. That was a huge problem for me. Most people didn't bother locking their doors, but I wasn't comfortable sleeping with mine unlocked. I had a spare, but I hated knowing the original was floating around somewhere. A few nights later, I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure why. Then I heard it. A faint bump. It came from my closet. At first, I thought I imagined it, but then it came again. A soft thud, like something shifting inside. Every 20 seconds or so, another bump. My chest tightened. I sat there frozen, listening, my heart racing. Finally, I decided I had to deal with it. Slowly, I climbed out of bed, my breath shallow. I crept toward the closet, every muscle in my body tense. Then, in one motion, I ripped the door open and shouted. What I saw will haunt me forever. She was in my closet, crouched low, eyes wide, with one of my ties wrapped around her neck. In her other hand, she clutched a kitchen knife. The moment I screamed, she lunged at me. The sound that came out of me then wasn't anger or bravado. It was raw terror. I barely managed to grab her wrist and knock the knife away. She fought like a wild animal, biting, scratching, shrieking. I wrestled her to the ground just as my housemate Lee came running. Together, we pinned her down while another housemate called the police. The rest of the night is a blur. The cops arrived quickly, arrested her, and found my missing key in her pocket. Weeks later, we finally got the full story. She was the property manager's sister. She suffered from severe mental illness, and instead of helping her or finding proper care, he'd just given her a room under the radar. He was later arrested for negligence and other charges, which he absolutely deserved. I blame him far more than her. But that doesn't change the fact that she tried to kill me. I could have died that night. I still don't know why she fixated on me. Why my room? Why me? I'm graduating soon, and I'll miss college in a lot of ways. But no matter what, I'll never forget that night, or the sight of her eyes staring at me from the darkness of my own closet. This isn't technically my story, but I watched it all unfold from my porch, and I still can't shake it. So I'm going to tell it the way I saw it. I've lived in the same quiet two-story home with my husband, Benjamin, for nearly 20 years. Our kids are grown, living their own lives now, and for the most part, things are peaceful. My days are simple, sitting out on the porch with some knitting, a good book, or a true crime podcast playing softly in the background. Benjamin usually sits beside me with the newspaper or the sports channel humming on his phone. It's not an exciting life, but it's ours, and I've always found comfort in that. For years, the house across the street sat empty. The shutters hung crooked, the paint on the siding started peeling, and weeds crept along the driveway. It was a bit of an eyesore, and more than that, it gave me an eerie feeling. Looking out at a lifeless house every morning made the neighborhood feel incomplete. So, when I noticed lights flickering on one evening and a moving truck in the driveway the next morning, I felt an unexpected wave of relief. The new neighbor was young, mid-20s at most. He drove a sleek black BMW and wore clothes that looked like they came straight off a rack in some upscale boutique. At first, I thought he was probably arrogant or spoiled, but when I finally met him, I realized I was wrong. His name was Quinn. He was polite, the kind of young man who made eye contact when he spoke and smiled in a way that seemed genuine. Benjamin took to him right away. The two of them spent hours on the porch talking about college days, about sports, about stocks and investments. I mostly listened, though I didn't understand half of what they were saying. Quinn explained that he worked freelance in the entertainment industry, helping out some online personality. Whatever it was, it must have been good money. He lived comfortably, always had the latest gadgets, and carried himself with confidence. For a few months, life settled into a pleasant rhythm. I'd sit outside and Quinn would wave on his way to work or when he pulled back into his driveway. He didn't seem like trouble, and in fact, I liked having a young, energetic person across the street. It made the neighborhood feel alive again. But then I noticed her. She was young too, maybe in her early 20s. She had long blonde hair that always looked freshly styled, and she drove a little white convertible that you could hear coming from half a block away. She was striking, but also a bit much. The kind of girl who wore short skirts and high heels just to run errands. She came around more and more often. At first, only once in a while, then almost every week. What stuck out to me was that she often arrived when Quinn wasn't home. She'd pull up, park casually in front of his house, and let herself in with a key. That part confused me. I assumed she was his girlfriend, but I couldn't understand why she'd spend hours in his house without him there. Sometimes she'd leave just minutes before Quinn came home. I didn't say anything. Young people live differently these days, I told myself. One evening, I finally saw them together. Quinn's BMW pulled up, and she stepped out of the passenger seat, laughing as she leaned against his arm. That confirmed it. She was his girlfriend. For a short while, everything seemed normal, but then the cracks started to show. I was out in my garden one afternoon when I heard shouting. My head shot up, and there they were, standing in Quinn's driveway. They were screaming at each other. She was waving her arms around, pointing her finger in his face, and from the look on Quinn's, he was exhausted, frustrated. Her voice carried across the street, sharp and furious, but I couldn't make out exact words. Still, I didn't need to. The way she was moving, clenched fists, stomping her heels, it looked like she was on the verge of hitting him. Finally, she stormed to her car, slammed the door, and tore down the road, the sound of her engine fading into the distance. Quinn just stood there for a moment, shaking his head, before trudging back inside. I mentioned it to Benjamin that night, but he brushed it off. "Couples fight," he said. "Don't get involved." So I tried to leave it at that. But then her visits started again. And not with Quinn. Her car showed up more than once when he wasn't home. She'd be inside for an hour, maybe two, and then drive away before his car pulled up. It was happening so often I couldn't ignore it. I told Benjamin, but he just sighed and reminded me that it wasn't our business. And maybe he was right. Maybe I was being nosy, but I had this gnawing feeling in my gut that something wasn't right. Then came the night that confirmed it. It was after midnight when sirens jolted me awake. Flashing red and blue lights poured through our bedroom window, and Benjamin and I scrambled out of bed. We stepped outside and saw the street alive with chaos. Police cruisers lined the road. An ambulance sat in Quinn's driveway. Neighbors had gathered in their yards, whispering, pointing. My heart was pounding as I gripped Benjamin's arm. That's when I saw her. The blonde. Ellie, I would later learn her name was. She was being led out of Quinn's house in handcuffs. Her face was completely blank. No tears, no screaming, no anger. Just nothing. It was chilling. Moments later, paramedics rolled Quinn out on a stretcher. His face was pale, his shirt soaked in blood. I gasped so loudly that a neighbor beside me flinched. I didn't know if he would make it. For more than a week, his house was silent. No lights, no car, nothing. Every day I sat on the porch, staring, wondering if he had even survived. Finally, one evening, his BMW pulled into the driveway. Quinn got out slowly, moving gingerly. but alive. Relief washed over me so powerfully I nearly cried. Benjamin and I walked over the next day to check on him. He looked tired, thinner, his face still pale, but he let us in, and that's when he told us everything. Her name was Ellie, and she had confessed. She was never supposed to have a house key. She'd stolen his spare and made a copy. From the very beginning, she had started pushing him for more: jewelry, fancy dinners, expensive trips. And when he didn't immediately give in, she got angry, possessive. But it went deeper than I could have ever imagined. She had linked his phone's location to her own. She knew where he was at all times, and every time she came over when he wasn't home, she wasn't just snooping. She was planting cameras, hidden ones, all over his bedroom. Every visit, she was replacing batteries, adjusting the angles, watching him, studying him. The fight I had seen in the driveway, that had been Quinn trying to break things off. He told her it wasn't working, but she refused to let go. Eventually, he reluctantly agreed to a break just to get her out of his face. But Ellie didn't accept that. She had been watching him through those cameras, listening, keeping track of everything he did. And the very next night, she showed up at his house with a knife. Quinn said he barely survived. She attacked him in his bedroom. He managed to fight back and drag himself outside, where a neighbor saw him and called 911, but not before she seriously injured him. The doctors told him he was lucky, just an inch away from dying. As he spoke, his hands trembled. His eyes darted to the windows as if he expected her to still be out there. Benjamin and I did our best to comfort him, but what could we say? Nothing could erase what had happened. Before we left, Quinn looked at us and said something I'll never forget. "I learned my lesson about showing off. You never really know who's watching or what they want from you." A few weeks later, he was gone. Packed up, moved out. He said he couldn't sleep in that house anymore, knowing Ellie's friends might know where he lived. We never saw him again. Even now, I sit on my porch sometimes and stare at that house. It's empty again, quiet. And every time I think of Quinn, I say a silent prayer that he's okay, because no one, no matter how young or naive, should ever have to go through something like that. When I moved into my new place, I wasn't looking for anything complicated. I just wanted a fresh start, a reset. I won't get into all the messy details, but let's just say my last relationship ended in a way that left me no choice but to pack my bags and leave my old city behind. Sometimes people bring out the worst in each other, and staying would have only dragged me deeper into something toxic. I was lucky, though. I had money early in life, made some smart moves, made some dumb ones, and more than once let the wrong kind of women into my life. I learned my lesson the hard way. So when I found this quiet little neighborhood, it felt like the perfect place to disappear for a while. It wasn't flashy, not the kind of place with trendy bars or nightlife. Instead, it was calm, low crime, almost all families. Exactly the opposite of the chaos I'd been living in. The houses were well spaced, each with a big yard, tall fences, lots of privacy. That was actually one of the things I liked most about it: space, breathing room. But my new house came with one strange detail: the property right next to mine. Unlike the others, which were all spread apart, this one was almost uncomfortably close. So close that, from my upstairs office, I could look right into my neighbor's yard without even meaning to. And his house, if you could even call it that, was massive. It looked like something that should have belonged to a family of 10. Huge windows, long driveway, too many rooms for one person to ever need. Naturally, I assumed a big family lived there. Parents, grandparents, kids, maybe even in-laws all crammed under one roof. But I couldn't have been more wrong. I made an effort to be a decent neighbor when I first moved in. Call it small-town etiquette, call it wanting to blend in. but I went door to door introducing myself. Most of the people I met were polite, friendly, and very, well, successful. Couples in their 30s and 40s with kids, careers, nice cars. The kind of people who made me feel out of place as a single guy in his late 20s. By the time I finally worked my way around to the house next door, my energy was drained. I had shaken too many hands, smiled too much, listened to too many stories about schools and community events I'd never go to. Still, I knew if I didn't do it then, I'd never get around to it. So, reluctantly, I walked up that massive driveway and rang the bell. What I expected was some middle-aged dad or maybe a sweet older couple. What I got instead was a young guy, maybe younger than me, wearing a mullet of all things. He swung the door open with this huge grin, and I was so caught off guard I almost forgot what to say. I stumbled through my little new-to-the-neighborhood speech, but he cut me off halfway with a laugh. "Oh wow, someone who was born in my decade," he said. "What a surprise around here." I laughed too because he wasn't wrong. I vented a little about how out of place I felt among all these families. He just shook his head and said most people here kept to themselves, which was a relief to hear. He introduced himself as Damon, and to my surprise invited me over for a drink sometime. Jokingly, I said, "Why not right now?" expecting him to laugh and wave me in. But instead, something strange happened. He froze, glanced over his shoulder into the house, like he was checking to make sure of something, then turned back and smiled, almost too quickly. "Can't tonight," he said. "I'm working." Naturally, I asked what he did for work. His smile faltered just for a second before he shrugged. "Finance," he said flatly. Then he changed the subject. That was the first moment I thought something about him was off. Over the next few months, Damon became somewhat of a mystery to me. We texted a few times, tried to set up a drink, but he always had an excuse. Busy with work. Maybe next week. Eventually, I gave up. What really unsettled me wasn't the excuses, it was his lifestyle, or rather the lack of one. Damon never had visitors, no friends, no dates, no deliveries. He never even left the house, at least not that I saw. His car was always parked in the driveway. And yes, I know how that sounds, like I was snooping. But you have to understand, my office window looked straight across at his property. All I had to do was glance up from my computer screen, and I could see his place clear as day. And the more I noticed how still his life seemed, the harder it was to ignore. Then came the night everything changed. It was a Wednesday. I remember that clearly because I had an early meeting scheduled the next morning. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of music. Loud music. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but when I sat up, I could feel the bass vibrating through the walls. I stumbled to the window and froze. Damon's driveway was crammed with cars, 6, maybe 7 of them. Music was blasting from inside the house, lights flickering behind the curtains. He was throwing a party. That struck me as odd. Damon had no social life, no visitors, no anything. And now, suddenly, a massive party in the middle of the week. I'm not the kind of guy to complain about noise, but this was insane. I pulled on a hoodie, crossed the yard, and knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked harder. Still nothing. Finally, I tried the handle. It opened. Inside, there was a pile of shoes by the door, at least a dozen pairs. Party shoes, sneakers, heels. But the house was empty. Completely silent except for the music blasting from somewhere deeper inside. No people, no laughter, no conversations. Then I listened closer. It wasn't music at all. Not really. It was a recording, a fake party soundtrack, clinking glasses, voices, laughter, all playing on loop. That's when the pit in my stomach formed. Against all logic, I moved further inside. Something drew me toward the basement door, which was cracked open just slightly. I don't know why, but I knew that whatever was happening, the answers were down there. The basement was dark, except for a faint glow coming from a room at the far end. As I crept closer, I heard it. A heavy grinding noise. Machinery. A saw, maybe. My heart sank. I pressed myself against the wall and peered through the gap in the door. Inside were 3 men. Older, dressed in heavy work clothes, thick gloves, goggles. They weren't drinking, weren't celebrating. They were focused on something across the room, something I couldn't see. And the smell. Bleach. Strong, chemical, almost burning my throat. I should have left right then, but I hesitated, frozen by curiosity and fear. Then suddenly the light behind me dimmed. Someone had shut the basement door. I didn't think. I ran, bolted up the stairs, through the foyer, out the front door, and into my yard. Instead of going inside, I leapt over my fence, slipped into the back entrance of my house, and locked everything behind me. From my darkened office, I watched Damon's house. Minutes later, the front door burst open, and a group of men, older, all wearing the same kind of heavy work gear, poured out. They scanned the yard, the street, the shadows. They were looking for someone, looking for me, but Damon wasn't with them. I ducked below my window, heart pounding, and stayed there until the music finally stopped. The next morning, every car was gone, Damon's included. Days passed, no sign of him, no sign of anyone. Packages began piling up at his front door. The lawn grew wild. It was like the house had been abandoned overnight. When I asked my neighbors if they'd heard the party, they looked at me like I was insane. None of them had heard a thing. To this day, Damon hasn't come back, and sometimes I wonder if he ever will.